Now, Netanyahu did respond in part to that pressure, but only in a very limited way. He adopted a very limited settlement freeze, which didn't even apply to East Jerusalem, which is where the most significant settlement expansion has taken place. Okay? So originally, Obama placed limited pressure on Netanyahu, and it yielded some limited results. But then, after Israel's settlement freeze expired, after a 9-month period, the U.S. failed to continue to keep up the pressure on Netanyahu to extend the settlement freeze and to deepen it so that it would also apply to East Jerusalem. Therefore, Israel was left with a free hand to pursue its expansionist territorial ambitions in the West Bank. And just to give you a little bit of background, settlements pose grave harm to Palestinians' rights and land and livelihood. Settlements are colonies that Israel built on the territories that it captured and occupied in 1967. Only Jews are allowed to reside there. And according to every international convention, settlements are blatantly illegal. Even the U.S. is on record stating that Israeli settlements are illegal and an obstacle to peace. Settlements can only be created at the expense of the Palestinians because inevitably privately owned Palestinian land is confiscated and the native inhabitants are displaced to make way for the expansion of settlements. And so many, and I think that this comparison is quite accurate, many equate the building and expansion of settlements to the theft of land that Palestinians need for an independent state in broad daylight. Theft in broad daylight. Settlement activity sends a very clear message that Israel is not interested in recognizing the Palestinians' legitimate claim to their land or their national aspirations. And even while peace negotiations were underway, settlement growth exploded from 280,000 settlers in 1993 to practically 520,000 today. The failure of U.S.-sponsored negotiations to force a halt to Israel's settlement activity is one of the primary reasons, if not the fundamental reason, why the Palestinians have decided to turn to the UN instead. Now, with respect to the issue of settlement building and how the Obama administration handled it, so it seemed like at the beginning that Obama was willing to turn the page and was willing to finally exert the pressure necessary for Netanyahu's government to stop the settlement drive once and for all. But the turning point that showed that this ray of hope was not going to be fulfilled came in February, when a resolution was introduced by the Palestinian Authority before the UN, which condemned Israeli settlement activity and called for the settlements to come to a complete stop. Okay? And what was most amazing about this resolution is that the wording and language of the resolution was borrowed from the statements of key U.S. policymakers themselves. Therefore, you know, in the minds of the Palestinians, it seemed inconceivable that the U.S. would veto its own official statements that it had made just a few months ago. But lo and behold, the U.S. ended up vetoing it, unbelievably. Okay, so what lesson did the Palestinians and Israelis draw from this episode? Well, on Israel's part, it simply learned that when the going got tough, all it had to do was hang tough in the face of international pressure, and the U.S. would be its knight in shining armor. It would eventually come to its rescue. And the Palestinians, on the other hand, drew the inevitable conclusion that the U.S. was simply not willing to put its weight behind the legitimate Palestinian demands for a cessation of settlement building. Now, another reason why the Palestinians have been forced to turn to the UN is because Israel, and especially the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, has been an unfair partner for peace. Okay, yes indeed, Netanyahu has finally come around belatedly to the viewpoint that the Palestinians should be allowed to establish a state. But what kind of state are we talking about? What we're basically talking about is a sham of a state. Okay, this is the kind of state that would have no real sovereignty or no real control over its own territory. The state that he has in mind, both in terms of its nature and the territory that it would control and its functions, falls well short of the conventional definition of statehood that's accepted by the entire international community. This state would have no control over its territory, very little, if any, control over natural resources such as water aquifers or even the airspace and borders. And then if that wasn't enough, another poison pill in Netanyahu's vision or concept of a Palestinian state is that he's totally, unequivocally opposed to the notion of a territorial compromise in Jerusalem. The Palestinians and the remainder of the international community have asserted that any Palestinian state to be viable must have its capital in East Jerusalem, which seems perfectly reasonable. But Netanyahu is dead set against that. How do we know that? Well, it says so in the Likud charter, in the charter of the party that Netanyahu is the head of. Namely, it says, Jerusalem is the eternal united capital of the state of Israel and only of Israel. The government will flatly reject Palestinian proposals to divide Jerusalem. Okay, but the idea that the Palestinians would not be able to establish a state with its capital in East Jerusalem is completely unacceptable. It's a non-starter because East Jerusalem is the commercial and spiritual nerve center of Palestinian life. And without that connection between East Jerusalem and the West Bank, there's no way that a Palestinian state could stand on its own 2 feet. And for that matter, no self-respecting Palestinian politician would ever accept such a sacrifice. And if they did, they would immediately be branded traitors by their own people. Okay, but then you might want to say, you know, and some have argued, many Israeli officials have argued that if the Palestinians have failed to achieve meaningful progress in negotiations, that they failed to fulfill their fundamental objectives, it's because the Palestinians themselves haven't acted in good faith. They haven't put their own best foot forward. So to reprise a very long-standing Israeli expression, quote, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Okay, so according to this notion, Israel has made generous offers time and time again that would have fulfilled the core expectations and standards that the Palestinians have set forth in the peace process, but the Palestinians have rebuffed each and every one of these offers. But I would counter that by saying that the offers that Israel often cites as evidence of its inherently generous and flexible nature often fell well short of minimum Palestinian requirements for a just solution to the conflict. A prime example of this is the Camp David negotiations that occurred in the summer of 2000, which resulted in a sweeping peace offer by then Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Okay, basically, Prime Minister Ehud Barak presented this as sort of the deal of a lifetime, one that the Palestinians simply couldn't refuse.